So yeah, thank you, Gordon and Hudson, for being able to talk. So this is joint work with my great colleagues Anna Scott from Bond, Natalie Taylor, New South Wales Cancer Council, and Jennifer Byrne at University of Sydney. And these slides are on my GitHub. That's GitHub. So if you can find GitHub, you can find the slides, because a lot of stuff that I've given is hyperlinked. I am talking to you today from QUT, and I acknowledge that this is the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people, the First Nations owners, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that QUT has always been a place where Aboriginal scholars continue to play an important role in the QUT community. And I will plug an Aboriginal scholar from my department called Chelsea Watago, who's written a book that's getting a lot of good attention at the moment, called Another Day in the Colony. So ethics is vital for research. I don't want anybody to come away from this talk thinking that I don't think that. And I acknowledge that I have a lot of big biases in this area, because I am a researcher and I only see one half of the process. I don't see some of the bad practices that ethics committees see. So please tell me if you think I've got it wrong. I'm very happy to be told that. I want to just start with 4 bad examples. The first one, this is a national vaccination study in Australia. And it was basically just a big data linkage project. So linking people's vaccination data with then, some of their adverse event data, hospital data and things like that. Really important study, not just to look at harms, but also to look at spillover benefits of vaccines, which, could be pretty important given what we're currently going through. It took these people 6 years to get the data from when they started. So the funding ran out well and truly before that data was received. So, they didn't have any money left over to do the actual analysis. Western Australia withdrew during the process, and it was they described it as a convoluted and inconsistent process, and they just had to deal with so many different forms and so many different committees. And this is just really a terrible example and a terrible waste of the public money and all these scientists' time. A much smaller bad example from some colleagues at the Prince Charles Hospital. They do some wonderful work on artificial hearts. But what happens is, when people have an artificial heart, they have to sort of have a connection to an external battery. The line that goes into people, the drive line, can sometimes get these really nasty fungal infections on it. So what the researchers wanted to do was, and then the patient has to come in and have a fairly detailed procedure to change the line over. And they threw that line in the bin. What they wanted to do was not throw the line in the bin, to take it to the lab, literally at the end of the corridor, and look at it under a microscope. And the patients wanted that too. Well, it took 11 months, censored actually, because by the time they finished this paper, they still hadn't got it. I've been told that it eventually took them 18 months, sort of 106 emails. They lost some of these rare and valuable samples. And, they used the word of over-bureaucratization, and, actually called it unethical. And again, this just seems to me to be a terrible waste of time and resources for I can't see where the risk is here when the patients want it and the surgeons want it. And I'm afraid there are an enormous number to choose from in Australia. A lot of researchers have published about this issue, about the amount of time taken. 2 examples from my own research. We did a randomized controlled trial of giving heart failure patients in Australia thermal clothing, because would you believe more people in Australia die of heart failure and myocardial infarction in winter than happens in Sweden. And this is probably because our houses are freezing inside, whereas in countries like Sweden and Norway, they're nice and toasty. So if we could wear proper clothing, we might be able to reduce this winter peak that we get in heart failure. But rather than just hand out what thermal clothing I thought was a good idea, I thought it'd be a good idea to talk with patients. And this is becoming much more encouraged these days, and I think that's a great thing. But I had to do a full NEFA protocol, a cover letter, a participant information sheet, and consent form and CV. So the approval process took me 4 months. The interviews with patients lasted 2 hours, and they were very useful, but it didn't feel to me at all commensurate with the level of risk. And it actually has completely put me off doing this kind of patient engagement in another trial, which is a bit sad, really. And this would delay getting this very valuable and useful information, just to have a chat with people about thermal clothing, which I can't see how that's in any way controversial. Another bad example, you may, drive-throughs are very popular in Australia, but you may not realise that they're actually a sort of perfect air pollution trap. So you'll see the way they're designed. They're basically these tunnels. And we have a lot of diesel cars in Australia. So people sit there with their engines idling, and then you have these young people sitting at a window, and they're potentially getting quite a decent dose of air pollution while they're working. It's also very easily fixed. You can have these air windows that just blow the pollution away into the driver's face, but that's probably not such an issue because they're not sitting there all day. So I wanted to look at this, a group of us wanted to look at this, so we got a protocol done, to install all these fancy air pollution monitors all around, inside and outside the staff working area. Then I tried to engage multiple companies, big and small, and none of them wanted a bar of this. So then I put in another application to try and conceal the purpose of what I was doing. And what we were going to do is just give these people these little badges. They look like a sort of key ring, and that would tell us the amount of benzene, which is a class 1 carcinogen, and a pretty nasty thing, especially that comes especially out of diesel vehicles. Well, my ethics application was rejected, and I was actually going to target staff who were thinking of leaving as well. There's high staff turnover in these places. So I just didn't really understand that. And this was a long time ago now, and I still look at these drive-throughs and think of all the potential harms. And actually there's a potential benefit for the companies as well, because one thing that air pollution does, of course, I was probably more interested in lung damage and probably very rare cancer. But one thing that air pollution does is just make you feel really sick. So it actually could have benefited the companies, because if they'd have done this, they might have noticed a reduction in staff absentee levels. So it sometimes feels, there's a great study here by Gilliman et al. And here's just 2 great quotes from that study. So I was once told by the chairperson of an ethics committee that he saw its role as making sure that the university didn't get sued. That's just not true. That's just not part of an ethics committee's job. But somehow this person feels as if that's become their remit. And another HREC member, to ensure that someone is not going off on a frolic that will destroy or damage the reputation of the university. Again, ethics committees are not there to protect the reputation of the university. And what I would say is, some stuff is a bit of a minefield. Some stuff is difficult, but, particularly for that air pollution one, we were a very highly qualified team. We'd done a lot of work in air pollution. We knew what we were doing. This is an important issue. And if you can't trust people like us, experts in demining fields, to go in there and do this, then the mines are going to stay there, and the risk and the dangers are not going to be addressed. So it does feel to me, having worked elsewhere and looked at studies, that there's too much oversight in Australia. And my colleague Anna Scott actually looked at this and looked at a whole heap of different OECD countries, and found that for exempting low-risk health and medical research, the broadest set of exemptions exist in the Netherlands and the narrowest in Australia. So researchers here have to do more applications compared to our colleagues in the Netherlands. And I will often see papers from colleagues in the Netherlands where the ethics section in the paper says, well, this didn't require ethics, whereas we've had to go through a full approval process. So that does harm our competitiveness as researchers competing on an international stage a bit. But I was also saying, just today, I'm actually at another conference, and we were debating, there's the idea that for journals, to try and get people to share their data, you put a badge on the paper, and me and my PhD student did a randomized trial of that. Now, the journal that we worked with consented everybody who submitted a paper to research projects. So we didn't feel as if we had to have consent, but our ethics committee felt differently. So we had to have a consent, and that dramatically harmed our sample size. And our study ended up actually being a bit too small, and now there's a lot of uncertainty. And so still today, like about 5 years later, I'm at a 1-hour debate on whether badges work or not. And I feel like, well, if we could have just done a proper randomized trial, we would have had a lot more certainty. There's a bit of ethics creep going on. I am actually genuinely interested in hearing the ethics committee's expertise. I may have overlooked something. I don't do this every day. I try and keep abreast of what's going on and what's important in ethics. But yeah, I may have missed something. So I want to hear their comments. I'm really not interested in getting typographical comments or comments on fonts or comments on justification or tiny wordings to the PICF that I just don't think are important. And I'm not the only, I'm not the only one. You hear, this is from the Gilliam et al. Study again, people complaining that, ethics committees will tinker with the methodology at the edges. I think that's outside their remit. Probably even more disturbing in the Gilliam et al. Study, 13 of the 14 ethics committee members included in the study indicated that they were aware of the national statement, but did not often refer to it. And 3 ethics committee members had actually not even read the national statement. So that's a bit of a problem. And actually, if you want to, I made an audio version of the national statement, so people can listen to it here, which was an interesting exercise. It's not all the ethics committee fault. Researchers are in an incredible rush to produce stuff. We have these ridiculous targets that we all need to meet, and I think that is a real problem. And I know that ethics committees do get applications that are really badly written and are unclear. And this is a great study by Caitlin Brandenburg and colleagues, and they looked at this and they found the quality of their submissions, including correct attachments, up-to-date documents, clear information, could account for a significant proportion of the burden and delay associated with ethical review. So yeah, people, were often putting in stuff and hadn't attached the protocol or the PICF, and that's just their own fault for delaying this process. I think there are important hidden costs. This is another study led by my colleague Anna Scott. And what we did was we surveyed Australian health and medical researchers and human research ethics committees. And what we found was that 43% of researchers reported changing projects in anticipation of obstacles from the ethics review process. So that's a bit of a hidden cost because you won't see that elsewhere as you ask people. So people are changing studies, and I'll just give you some examples in a minute before they even put them in. Possibly even more disturbing, 25% of researchers reported just abandoning projects because of the ethics, and we will have that discussion here as well. We'd love to do that study, but we just don't think we'd get ethics for it. Another thing that people did a lot was research methods were altered so that a project could be classified as low or negligible risk rather than higher risk to avoid a full ethics review. But, possibly reducing the quality of the evidence that's going to come out of that. So, some of the quotes to the way people change their application, avoiding obtaining data from certain groups, for example, those under 18, pregnant women, Indigenous people, and those with a disability. Well, that is a well-known problem now that other people have done research on, that a lot of the evidence we have in medicine just doesn't apply to a whole bunch of people because they've been excluded from the trials and the observational studies for this intention of protecting them is actually going to end up harming them in the end. Reducing the number of HRECs involved, especially those known to have a few sittings a year and very long lead time. So there's some ethics shopping going on. But of course, if you're doing multi-center trials, that's a great way of increasing your sample size, increasing your power and reducing your uncertainty. So there's a cost for evidence there. I'm an Aboriginal researcher undertaking Aboriginal community health research in my own community. The HREC regarded my situation as a conflict of interest, so I changed my ethics application status from CIA to CID so I could continue to engage with my community. I mean, that to me just seems completely crazy. We want Aboriginal researchers leading this research, and that has actually probably harmed their career because, in this silly research world we have, being CIA is such an important marker on your CV. So that person to continue to do that research had to take a hit to their CV. Many projects I've been involved with have been abandoned because the ethics approval process took too long and is too laborious, especially for junior researchers. And yeah, we had lots of examples of people who employed an RA for a year. By the end of the year, they had their ethics, but no money left over and no RA to do the project. Current processes for low risk are so cumbersome at my local health service, 100-page submission that still needs to be signed off by CEO of the hospital, even for low risk, with site governance from another committee. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these signatures, I mean, I doubt the CEO is really reading these in detail. It just seems to be overly bureaucratic. And we gave them, in our survey, we gave them a whole heap of different scenarios, sort of the range quite nicely, as you can see here, from low risk to high risk. So this is the probability on the bottom here of answering that ethics is required, and I've given the mean and confidence interval of that uncertainty. And you can see the researchers' answers in purple and the HREC's answers in this red color. And I don't want to go into what all these were in detail, but you can see, but for every single scenario, you know, the researchers had a lower probability that this needed an ethics clearance, whereas the people on the HREC thought otherwise. So there does definitely seem to be a disconnect between us and them, for want of a better phrase. And a very interesting result we got was a lot of HREC people saying the criteria that pushes us over the threshold for ethics review is the desire to publish and disseminate the research further. Well, that's not a criteria that I've ever read in the national statement. And there are plenty of journals around the world where you can tell the journal why it didn't need ethics review. You know, some of the best medical journals in the world allow that. So that's a very strange misconception, which we're not really sure where that's come from. So what we did was we actually decided to start a petition to ask for a national inquiry. And this was mostly because it's the one thing we all talk about when we get to conferences. I will tell you, if you hear the word ethics, people will crowd around and they will want to tell you their horror stories too. And we really wanted to show to some of the important policymakers and to government that it wasn't just a few cranky researchers doing this, that there was widespread feeling about this across the nation. So we got 878 signatures and again, some really interesting quotes. So our department usually has about 16 active trials at a time and now has a dedicated nurse just to manage ethics and governance requirements at a cost of $130,000 a year. So, I mean, I think that's really interesting, that a way to deal with this is that you have to, if you want to be successful in this area, you now have to employ people to deal with the system. I'm not sure that was ever what the system wanted or what the system was designed for. I've lost funding previously because governance requirements could not be met within funding timelines, and we had stories of cancer researchers having to give back the money to the funder because you know, that they hadn't met their timelines, and that was the end of that. As a busy clinical researcher, I spend hundreds of unpaid hours doing these forms, and often after hours. Regulatory hurdles are harming patients by delaying vital research. And this simple quote, which we really like: no country can't say this word, bureaucratized its way to excellence. So I think that's just a very nice, pithy quote that sums up a lot of the feelings of researchers. So we took our petition and some other evidence, and we met with the science ministers, we met with Karen Andrews' staff member, who was very encouraging and gave us some interesting advice and really seemed to get the issues very quickly. So we submitted a brief to the health minister, including some economic costs, which I'll describe in a minute, and some of these survey quotes. Also discussed this with the Labour MP, Andrew Lee, and another Labour staff member. We got no response from the Greens. We met with Medicines Australia, who were very interested in this, particularly around clinical trials, and had a very good meeting with them. And we had a session at an AMOS conference and frequently talked with other researchers about this and got a lot of emails. And if you want to see all our documents that we submitted are all openly available here. In terms of economic savings, what we did was we said, well, what if we changed the system here to move to a self-certification system for low-risk research, which is the system that they have in the US. So the most litigious nation in the world has actually a much simpler system than we do. So we tried to estimate, based on PubMed data, the number of low-risk and negligible research projects in Australia, tried to estimate the rough amount of time needed in ethics approval and the salary costs, and you get $168 million a year that the health and medical research community is currently spending on low-risk research. If we move to the simplified self-certification system, we think that our estimate was about 5 million. So that's annual savings of about $163 million, not in cash, but in time, but in time of medical researchers. So feel pretty valuable. The response we got from Greg Hunt, we approached him about this back in February 2017, and he told us positive change is coming, and we got almost the same letter, slightly longer letter in April 2020, that positive change is coming. So it always feels like positive change is coming. And I'm aware of the review that the Australian Commission for Quality in Healthcare and Safety are doing in this area. And look, I really hope that positive change does come, but I'm not holding my breath. It's also potential that things could get worse. I mean, in the consultation by the NHMRC on the national statement, the proposed change in wording was that all research should be assessed for level of risk. Well, there's a chance that somebody would interpret that as talking about systematic reviews, which are very important, part of the evidence. So Paul Glasio, who does a lot of systematic reviews, says if someone starts asking for ethical approvals of systematic reviews, I'm prepared to go to jail, which is a copy of something Sir Richard Dole once said. So that's the end of what I wanted to say. And I'll just end with this quote again from this really good study by Gilliman et al. I think researchers hate ethics committees. I have rarely found a researcher, and I mean good researchers, mediocre and bad, in my realm of work every year who don't bitch about ethics committees. I think that's a really terrible situation to be in. As Gordon said there, I think there's much more room for more dialogue on this. And I'm genuinely interested in better dialogue and making some, and I'll end there.